My stepsister and I had been talking about this cabin trip for a while. We both wanted to get away from the busy city and have some quiet time. The cabin we found was small, hidden deep in the woods. It took us hours to drive there, but when we finally arrived, it looked perfect. It was surrounded by tall trees, and there was nothing around for miles. No people, no noise, just peace and quiet. It was exactly what we were looking for. The first night felt normal. We unpacked our stuff, made something to eat, and sat by the small fireplace. There was no phone signal, no TV, nothing but the sound of the wind and the woods outside. At first, it felt kind of nice, but the quiet started to feel heavy after a while. I couldn't stop noticing how silent everything was. By the time we went to bed, I was feeling a bit weird about it, but I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to this much quiet. The next day, we decided to walk around the woods near the cabin. The trees were really thick, and there weren't many clear paths. It felt like we were the only people around for miles. After walking for a while, I saw something strange. There was a pile of rocks stacked neatly near a tree. It didn't look like it was there naturally. Someone had to have put them there. Something about it made me stop and stare. My stepsister didn't think much of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't really alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind outside seemed louder, and I kept hearing what sounded like footsteps just outside the cabin. I tried to tell myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but my mind wouldn't let it go. I stayed awake, listening for every little sound. The footsteps would come and go, like someone was slowly walking around the cabin. It would stop, then start again a few minutes later, like they were circling us. By morning, I was exhausted but relieved nothing bad had happened. My stepsister was still asleep, so I stepped outside to get some air. That's when I saw it. The same pile of rocks from the day before, but now it was closer to the cabin. I hadn't noticed it there last night. It was just sitting at the edge of the clearing, like a marker. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself it had always been there, but I knew it hadn't. I didn't tell my stepsister about it. Maybe I was just overthinking. We spent the day trying to enjoy ourselves, walking further into the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. The deeper we went into the woods, the more it felt like someone was following us. But every time I looked around, there was no one there. When we got back to the cabin, there was another pile of rocks, right by the front door. This one was bigger, taller, like someone had been working on it while we were gone. My skin crawled, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. Someone was playing with us, messing with our heads, but there was no sign of anyone around. No footprints, no sound, nothing. That night was worse. I woke up again to the sound of footsteps, but this time they were louder and closer. My heart was pounding as I lay in bed, too scared to move. The footsteps stopped right outside the cabin, and then I heard a soft knock on the window. It wasn't loud or fast, just a slow, quiet tap, like whoever was out there wanted me to know they were there. But they weren't in any rush. They knew I wasn't going anywhere. I didn't dare look. I just stayed there, my eyes shut tight, waiting for it to go away. It felt like forever, but eventually, everything went quiet again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, my stepsister finally noticed the rock piles. She mentioned how strange it was, but she didn't seem scared, just confused. I couldn't take it anymore. I told her we needed to leave. Something wasn't right, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what was going on. She didn't argue much, but I could tell she thought I was overreacting. As we packed up, I kept checking over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching us the entire time. We loaded up the car and started down the dirt road, and I felt a bit better. I thought maybe we were finally safe, getting away from whatever had been out there. But as we turned onto the main road, I looked back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw him. There was a man standing in the clearing, right where the rock piles had been. He wasn't moving, just watching us leave. I couldn't see his face clearly, but it didn't matter. The fact that he had been out there the whole time made my stomach drop. He had been there watching us and we never knew. The worst part was realizing how close he had been to us, how easily he could have done something if he wanted to. As we drove away, the feeling didn't leave me. The thought of him standing there, watching us like we were prey, stuck with me long after we were gone. And then it hit me we were lucky to get out when we did. He wasn't just watching, he was waiting. And whatever he was waiting for, I'm terrified that we almost found out. I was sent out for a solo night shift. The call came in about a cabin way out in the woods, miles away from any main road. The dispatcher said someone reported hearing strange noises, maybe an intruder. Seemed like a routine call. I drove out there, the cabin sitting in the middle of thick trees. It was completely cut off, with nothing but forest and silence all around. The air was cold, and the light from my car barely lit up the trees. As soon as I stepped out of the car, I could feel it. This silence wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, like something was off. My breath felt loud in the air. I turned on my flashlight and slowly walked toward the cabin. It was old, falling apart. The door was closed but didn't seem locked. As I reached for the handle, I stopped. I heard a soft creak from inside. It wasn't loud, more like someone moving but trying to stay quiet. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. My flashlight cut through the darkness, showing me the small living room. There wasn't much, just an old couch, a small table, and some dusty shelves. No sign of anyone. I moved carefully, checking each corner. My heart was beating faster now. The air inside felt stale, thick. I went through each room, but I found nothing. The windows were all shut, and it seemed like no one had been there for a long time. Except for one thing, a faint, sour smell, like something rotting. I figured it might be a dead animal, but something caught my eye. The rug in the middle of the living room looked slightly out of place, like someone had moved it recently. I bent down and pulled it back, revealing a hatch, a small wooden door set into the floor. It wasn't locked. I froze for a second, then lifted it. A narrow set of stairs led down into a basement. I pointed my flashlight down, but it barely lit anything. The smell got stronger as I walked down, each step creaking under my weight. At the bottom, the air felt damp and hard to breathe. My flashlight flickered as it moved across the room, showing a dirt floor and wooden beams. Then I saw it, piles of dirt, like something had been buried there. In the corner, a rusty old shovel leaned against the wall. I stepped closer to the dirt piles, my heart racing now. That's when I saw it. A hand, half buried in the dirt. It was pale, lifeless, fresh. The skin still looked new. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Someone had been buried here recently. I rushed back up the stairs, slamming the hatch behind me. I grabbed my radio to call for backup, but all I got was static. Nothing. I stepped outside, and the woods felt even worse, like they were closing in on me. I hurried back to my car, but as I reached for the door, I stopped cold. The driver's seat was covered in blood. The car had been locked when I left it. No one had passed me in the woods. I stood there, my mind spinning. Whoever buried that body wasn't gone. They were still out here watching me. My stomach dropped. I backed away from the car slowly, pulling out my gun, my eyes darting through the trees. But the silence was back. That strange, heavy silence that told me I was alone, and at the same time, not alone at all. As I stood there, I noticed something on the ground by the edge of the forest. Footprints, fresh ones, heading away from the cabin. They weren't mine, and they weren't leading deeper into the woods. They were circling around. Whoever it was, they had been watching me the whole time, following me, and they weren't done yet. I realized then I wasn't getting out of these woods. Not alive, anyway. It was 1996, and I took a short trip to the German countryside. I rented a small cabin, far out in the woods, away from any towns. The cabin was simple, old, with wooden walls that creaked when you walked. The air outside was chilly and damp, but inside, once I lit the fire, it was warm enough. I didn't really have any big plans. I just wanted to relax, maybe take a few walks in the forest to clear my head. The first few days were quiet. I spent my time reading and walking the narrow paths around the cabin. The forest was thick, and if you didn't pay attention, you could get lost easily. I didn't see many animals, just some rustling in the bushes now and then, or a bird flying by. On the third night, something felt off. As the sun started to go down, a heavy fog rolled in, covering the trees and making everything around the cabin disappear. Felt even more lonely than before. At first, I didn't think much of it, but something about the quiet started to bother me. There were no usual sounds, no wind in the trees, no animals moving around. I went to bed early, hoping to sleep it off, but as I lay there, I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a soft scratching sound from outside. At first, I thought it was a tree branch against the cabin, but the noise didn't stop. It was steady, sharp, like something was dragging across the wood. I tried to ignore it, but it just kept going. It sounded like it was right outside my window. I sat up, straining to hear. The scratching changed to a light tapping, like someone or something was touching the window, feeling it out. I felt a shiver run through me, but not from the cold. I didn't move. My heart was racing, but I stayed frozen in place. The tapping went on and on. I kept waiting for it to stop, but it felt like it never would. And then, all of a sudden, it did. The silence that followed was worse. I lay there, tense, expecting something else to happen. I didn't move, didn't even breathe too loudly. But after a long while, there was nothing. Just the thick, heavy quiet of the fog outside. I stayed awake the whole night, staring at the window, waiting for the sound to come back. But it didn't. When the first light of morning came, I finally got out of bed. I felt uneasy, but I needed to know what had been making that noise. I walked over to the window and looked closely. There were thin lines on the glass, like something had scratched it. I knew then I wasn't staying another night. I packed my stuff quickly and stepped outside. The fog was still hanging around, making the whole place feel strange. I was ready to leave, but when I walked around the side of the cabin, I froze. In the dirt right under the window were deep tracks. They were uneven and strange, not like anything I'd seen before. Too long and narrow to be from any animal I knew. My heart was pounding. I didn't want to figure out what it was. I grabbed my stuff, threw it into the car, and got out of there, not even looking back. I never found out what made those sounds or left those tracks. Part of me doesn't want to know. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the soft tapping at the window, like it was waiting for me to come closer. I always wonder what would have happened if I had. Would it have come inside? Or was it just waiting for the right moment to get in? I always loved going to my grandmother's cabin. It was deep in the woods, surrounded by thick trees, and far from the noise of the town. Out there, it was peaceful, a place where I could breathe and clear my head. Every summer growing up, I spent a few weeks with her, helping around the cabin, going on hikes, or just sitting on the porch, watching the trees sway. But this summer felt different. Maybe it was because I hadn't been back in years. Grandma had passed away a couple of years ago, and the cabin had been empty since then. I was the only one in the family who still cared about the place. My parents wanted to sell it, but I convinced them to let me keep it. I wasn't ready to let go, so I decided to spend the weekend there by myself just to be in that space again. When I arrived, everything looked the same. The old rocking chair still sat on the porch. The air smelled like pine trees, and the wind rustled the leaves like it always did. But there was something off this time. It wasn't obvious at first, but it grew on me. Maybe it was the silence. The kind of silence that presses on your ears, making everything feel too quiet, like something was missing. Even the birds weren't chirping, which was strange for a place like this. I shook it off, thinking I was just overthinking things since it had been so long. I spent the day cleaning the cabin, airing it out, and putting things back in place. By the time night came, I was exhausted. I sat on the porch with a beer in hand, looking out at the dark forest. The trees were completely still, and the only sound was the creaking of the porch under my chair. It should have been peaceful, but the quiet started to bother me. The cabin never felt this lonely before. I went inside, locked the doors, and decided to go to bed early. The cabin grew cold as the night went on. I lay in bed, staring at the wooden ceiling, trying to fall asleep, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a noise. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer wandering close to the cabin. But then I heard it again, and this time it was clearer. Footsteps, slow and heavy, like someone was trying to walk quietly on the porch. I froze in bed, my heart pounding. The cabin had no curtains, so I could see the faint moonlight coming through the windows. Shadows of the trees outside moved gently, but there was something else moving too, closer. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside the front door. I lay there, hoping I was imagining things. But then I heard a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the door. My chest tightened. No one should have been out here. I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived, and the nearest house was miles away. I got out of bed slowly, trying not to make any noise, and grabbed the flashlight from the table. I crept to the door, heart racing, and looked through the small window. In the dim light, I saw movement, but it was hard to make out what it was. Something or someone was definitely out there. I backed away from the door, unsure of what to do. The scraping sound continued, louder now. I thought maybe it was an animal, but deep down I knew better. This wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too controlled. I moved quickly to the back door, the one that opened into the woods, and quietly unlocked it. The cold night air hit me as I slipped outside, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from the cabin, away from whatever was out there. I didn't have a plan, but I knew staying inside wasn't an option. I moved through the trees, trying to stay low and quiet. The forest felt different, heavier, like the darkness was pushing in on me. I could still hear the scraping in the distance, but it was fading as I moved farther away. I found a spot between some thick trees and crouched down, listening, trying to calm my breathing. I waited there for what felt like hours, my body stiff from the cold and fear. The noises from the cabin stopped eventually, but I didn't move. I was too scared to go back. I waited until the sky started to lighten with dawn before I worked up the courage to return. When I got back, the front door was wide open. I knew I hadn't left it that way. I stepped inside cautiously. Everything looked the same except for the front door. It had deep scratches across it, long and rough, like claw marks. But no animal could have made those. They were too perfect, too intentional. There were no signs of anyone around, no tracks, nothing. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my stuff and left, not looking back at the cabin. I haven't told anyone what happened that night, and I haven't been back since. The cabin is still in my name, but I'll never go back. Whatever was out there that night, it knew I was there, and I'm not sure it was ever planning to leave. felt like it was waiting for something. Maybe it still is. It was a cold November weekend when my college friends and I decided to rent a cabin in the mountains to get away from exams. The cabin was far from anything, tucked deep in the woods, and we thought it would be a perfect break from our busy campus life. We got there in the late afternoon, and the setting sun made long shadows through the trees. The cabin was old but cozy, with creaky floorboards and a big stone fireplace that crackled with warmth. We unpacked and spent the evening playing games and hanging out. By midnight, the cabin was quiet except for the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. I had the top bunk in the room we had turned into a makeshift dorm. As I was trying to fall asleep, I heard a faint noise coming from outside. It sounded like something scratching or dragging across the ground. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just branches hitting the cabin or maybe an animal. The noise got louder and more persistent. It seemed to be coming from the back of the cabin. I got up, went to the window, and looked out. It was so dark I couldn't see anything but trees and shadows. I decided to check it out, thinking it was probably just a branch stuck somewhere. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the cold air hitting me hard. The noise was clearer now, definitely something scraping. I walked around to the back of the cabin, shining the light around. The ground was covered in leaves and dirt, but I couldn't see what was making the sound. Then I saw something strange, a fresh trail of disturbed earth leading away from the cabin. The trail was narrow and seemed to lead towards a small, overgrown shed we hadn't noticed before. My heart started to race. The noise had stopped, but I felt uneasy. I approached the shed, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The door was slightly open, and I hesitated before pushing it wide. Inside, it was completely dark, and I could barely make out old tools and a few rusty barrels. I didn't see anything strange, but the creepy feeling didn't go away. Just as I turned to leave, the flashlight flickered and went out. I struggled with the batteries, my hands shaking. When I finally got it working again, the light revealed a dark figure standing just outside the shed. It was tall, and its shape blended into the shadows. Fear hit me hard, and I ran back to the cabin. I slammed the door shut behind me, breathing heavily. I couldn't sleep that night, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had seen. In the morning, we discovered deep, jagged claw marks on the cabin's wooden siding. It looked like something had tried to claw its way in. We packed up quickly and left, feeling a heavy sense of dread. As we drove back to college, no one said much about what happened. It was clear that whatever we had seen wasn't just an ordinary animal. The cabin had seemed like a fun escape, but it ended with a terrifying reminder that sometimes being alone in the woods can bring you face to face with something you're better off not knowing. And the worst part? The claw marks were still there, deep and ugly, a silent witness to whatever had been trying to get inside. I had always wanted to get away for a weekend, away from the noise of the city. Renting an old cabin in the woods seemed like a good idea at the time. I found one online, cheap, far from everything, no cell signal or internet. It sounded perfect. I packed up a few things, grabbed my sleeping bag, and left early that Friday morning. When I got there, the cabin looked just like the pictures. It was old, built from dark wood that had seen way too many winters. The roof drooped a bit, and the windows were small and dirty, hard to see through. There was a little porch with one rocking chair. Trees surrounded the cabin so tightly that only a bit of sunlight could get through. Felt like I had traveled back in time. It was completely silent, except for the leaves rustling and the wind making the cabin creak a little. I unpacked my stuff and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like dust and wet wood. There were only 2 rooms. A tiny kitchen with an old, rusty stove, and the main room with a fireplace and a bed that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. A few animal skins hung on the walls, giving the place a weird, distant feeling, like it didn't belong to this time. That first night, I started a fire in the fireplace and sat down to read. The wind was getting stronger outside, brushing against the cabin, but inside it was quiet, too quiet. I could only hear the fire crackling, and before I knew it, I was falling asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. The fire had almost burned out, leaving the room in complete darkness, and the wind outside was now a constant howl. At first, I thought it was just the noise that had woken me up, but then I heard something else, a soft scraping sound. It was faint, but I could hear it. It was coming from the back wall of the cabin, right behind the bed. I stayed still, listening carefully. The sound was quiet but steady, like something or someone was dragging something sharp across the wood. My heart started beating faster, but I tried to tell myself it was probably just an animal outside. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore it, hoping it would stop. Didn't. I got out of bed, grabbed the flashlight I had brought, and walked to the back window. I shone the light outside, expecting to see a raccoon or maybe a branch scraping against the cabin. But there was nothing. The trees were swaying in the wind, leaves scattered on the ground, but no animal, no branch. I went back to bed, trying to brush it off, but the scraping kept going, slow and steady, all night long. By the next morning, the noise had stopped, and I convinced myself it was nothing. I spent the day hiking around the woods nearby, trying to enjoy the quiet. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every time I stopped to look around, the trees were still, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. That night, as soon as the fire started to die down, the noise came back. This time, it was louder, and it wasn't just behind the bed. It was circling the cabin, slowly. The scraping sound moved around the outside walls, like something was dragging its nails along the wood, tracing a path around the cabin. Cold sweat started to drip down my neck. I grabbed the flashlight again and moved toward the door, ready to see what was out there. But the second my hand touched the doorknob, the scraping stopped. I stood there, frozen, listening. The silence was thick. Then I heard a heavy thud, right against the front door. I backed away slowly, feeling my heart hammering in my chest. For the next few hours, the noise picked up again, moving faster around the cabin, mixing with loud bangs against the walls. I felt trapped. Every time I thought about opening the door, the sound grew louder, like it was warning me to stay inside. I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until the noise finally stopped, and as soon as the first bit of morning light came through the window, I grabbed my stuff and rushed to my car. I didn't care what was outside or what had been making those noises. I just knew I had to get out of there. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. It looked just the same as it did when I first got there, old, quiet, like it had been forgotten. But now, something about it felt different, as if it had been watching me the whole time. And the scraping stopped the second I left. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on familiar roads. I didn't look back after that. But whatever was out there, it was real, and it wasn't just in my head. I don't know why the noises only happened at night or what was causing them. But here's the part that keeps me up at night. I looked up the cabin when I got home, just to see if anyone else had noticed anything strange about it. The listing had been taken down, and I couldn't find it anywhere, like it had never existed. I don't know who or what was out there, but it didn't want me there. And I know I'll never be able to forget that sound. I was alone at my cabin for the weekend, a rare chance to get away from everything. My neighbor's cabin was only a short walk through the trees, but they were away on vacation. I had planned on a peaceful weekend of reading and relaxing, but things took a creepy turn. It started on the second night. I was lying in bed when I heard a faint noise outside, like something scraping along the ground. I thought it was just the wind or maybe an animal, but it kept bothering me. I tried to ignore it and went back to sleep. The next morning, I noticed fresh tracks in the dirt leading from the neighbor's cabin toward mine. They were strange, not like any animal tracks I knew. I figured someone might have been passing through and just taken a shortcut. That night, the noise came back, but it was louder and closer. I stayed still, listening as the sounds moved around the cabin. It was clearly human footsteps and rustling. My heart raced as I lay there, too frightened to move. The cabin was locked tight, but I felt exposed and vulnerable. When the noise finally stopped, I forced myself to check outside. I saw that the tracks from earlier had changed direction. They led away from my cabin, back toward the neighbor's place. Something felt seriously wrong. I decided to act. I called the local sheriff's office and explained what was going on. They said they'd send someone over, though it might take some time. While I waited, I kept my phone close, staying alert and ready for anything. When the deputy arrived, they discovered signs of a break-in attempt at the neighbor's cabin. Turned out someone had been watching the area for days, planning to break in. They had also been keeping an eye on my cabin, maybe thinking about hitting it next. The deputy told me there had been a string of similar break-ins in the area and warned me to be extra cautious. The realization that someone had been so close, watching me, was terrifying. I was relieved I hadn't confronted them alone. The sheriff's office promised increased patrols, but the fear lingered. I made sure to lock every door and window tightly. That night, the cabin felt even more like a prison. I kept the lights on and the doors locked, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The peaceful retreat I had hoped for was replaced by a constant sense of dread. As I lay in bed, the sound of something scratching at the window made my blood run cold. I knew I wasn't alone, and the thought that someone might still be out there, waiting for their chance, left me with a chilling sense of fear.